Hey y'all, thanks for tuning in to How to Rewrite Your Inner Story and Live Free. So old stories can keep us trapped in fear, doubt, shame, survival patterns. And this video is going to show you how to recognize the story that you've been living and the story that you've been told, how to reauthor it, and how to step into the freedom that starts with one thought at a time. And if you listened to the pod earlier this week, you know that I talked about the origin of those stories, and we really dug into the fact that a lot of the things that you believe to be true about yourself weren't narratives that were created by you, but they're narratives that were created in your formative years. And when that is the case, you start to develop an identity and believe an identity that was conditioned into you as opposed to one that you were crafted for. And so when you think about those limiting beliefs that you have, when you think about the negative thoughts that you have about yourself, first you have to identify what is an area of growth and what is a limiting belief. So an area of growth is when you identify that you have this pattern or this habit that you keep doing and you want to stop doing that thing because it's an opportunity for you to grow. Let's say you don't listen well in conversation and you really want to get better at listening. So you develop the habit of pausing, paraphrasing, and adding concept conversation. That is an area of growth. Let's say that you are somebody who constantly cuts people off because you get really excited about the thought that's in your head. An area of growth might be, okay, I really don't want to do that anymore. I want to get good at listening to them and then waiting my turn. And so I'm going to develop a pattern so that I can stop doing that. Another area of growth. The repeating patterns that are a narrative that have been conditioned into you is when you take those areas of growth or something that you deem to be negative and you start to tell yourself stories about yourself because of it. So I'm a poor communicator. I don't know how to have a conversation. No one wants to hear me talk. I'm not enough or I'm too much in the conversation. People only want me or think that I'm valuable when I add something to their life by doing something for them. I'm a know-it-all. I'm stupid. I'm like all these things that you start to believe. It's the negative conditioning that you've received and the repetition of that message that are what we're talking about today. That inner story, that limiting belief is that I am this because of this. Growth says I do this and I want to get better at this thing, but the limiting belief says I am this because this is what I've always been told. The first thing we have to do is identify where that narrative comes from. And if you didn't create it yourself, then it comes from something. If it's a limiting belief, it probably comes from someone in your formative years who benefited from you believing that to be true. And we're not talking about things that we believe to be true that are going to help us to grow, like our biblical principles and, moral compasses. We're not talking about those things. We're talking about things that limit who you are based on a story that you've been told. And most of the time, the people who tell us those stories are benefiting from us believing it to be true. If someone says, I'll give you an example, in past toxic relationships, someone told me no one's going to want you because you have kids by different men. And I'm here standing in the narrative today that my fiance loves me regardless of that. He doesn't see me differently because of that. But for years, I stayed in that relationship because I didn't think that anybody else was going to want to be with me. And he benefited from that narrative and conditioning it into me because the longer he told me that, the longer I believed it, the longer I stayed without him having to do anything. But you don't have to live there. You can reframe that negative narrative. So you pick that limiting belief and you say, okay, this limiting belief is telling me that I'm damaged. And it came from someone who benefited from me being damaged. The reason we do that part is that's how you interrogate the truth of the conditioning. Because if somebody else benefits positively from you believing something negatively about yourself, then it helps you to see that they were only telling you that story, not because it was true, but because they needed you to act in a certain way because of it for them to benefit from that story. The next thing we do is we think about how to reframe that narrative. So instead of saying, I'm damaged, nobody's going to want me, I can stop that thought in its tracks and say, God has a plan for me regardless of my past. My past does not define me. God created somebody specifically for me. There's going to be somebody who loves me regardless of what I've experienced in the past. And if you're in that space today, I'm here to tell you that oftentimes there's beauty in waiting for that person, because the person who accepted my past and loves me regardless has a past too. So he has empathy and sympathy for the fact that I have a past, because his past is muddled with things that he's not proud of as well. But guess what? I don't judge him for those things, because I have empathy for the fact that he has a past and things happened in his past. And he was sitting and ruminating in what he thought was the truth, but was actually a conditioned narrative that he'd failed so many times that who would want to try this with him again, because obviously he was damaged. And so we can think about those narratives and we can reframe them. We can say, if that didn't come from me, then what did this person gain by having me believe that to be true? And then we can say, okay, what's the truth of this story? And that is what we start to tell ourselves. Every time you hear that narrative that says, I'm damaged, you can tell yourself the new thing. I have a past and so does everyone else. My past has created the person who's in the present. I learn from my mistakes. I don't become them. And you reframe that narrative by saying something positive about who you are today as a result of that thing that has perpetuated in your life. If you feel like you're not enough and you've been told that your entire life, you're never going to be good enough, you're never going to amount to anything, even if you're not doing everything that you want to be doing, because that limiting belief has also been a self-fulfilling prophecy. You've become exactly who they said you were going to be, because what else would you become if that's what you've always been told? You can stop that too. You can sit right in and say, right now I'm in this space. But that doesn't mean that this is where I'm going to end. It's not my end destination. So what am I going to do to become exactly what was put in me to be? And you can start to make a plan to make that happen. So when the narrative comes up that says, you're not enough, you're never going to amount to anything, you can tell yourself, I'm not exactly who I want to be yet, but I'm well on my way. I'm making a plan to be on my way. So stop the thought and replace it with something that is the true narrative about who you are and who God crafted you to be. And then you actually have to embody it. You give that statement truth by saying what you know to be true. You interrupt the patterns of thinking that you've had from the past, and then you actually walk in that every single day. So if you're walking in that space where you feel like you're damaged and no one's going to want you, then you're only going to attract people who see that you're damaged and benefit from it. But if you stop that thought process and you say, I'm learning from my past, I'm making good choices now, the past created who I am today, you will start to notice that your attraction, not even just romantically, but just your connection with people, the vibe that you give off attracts people who see that about you. And then you just walk in it every day. You change the thought process, it changes the narrative, and now you're going to change the behavior. Because an interruption of thought process is going to be an interruption of behaviors that have been formulated as habits. And once you interrupt that, then the belief starts to catch up with what you actually know to be true instead of attaching to that old narrative. So you really have to think today, right now, what is that one persistent narrative that has been plaguing you? And rewrite it. Write it down in your journal. Rewrite that negative narrative into a positive one. Something that is true. Something that you know to be true today, no matter what you've been told in your past. And then continue to repeat it to yourself throughout the day. If you see that your behaviors aren't matching what you're repeating, then change the behavior. Small shifts, not a huge overhaul, because that doesn't work. And then once you start to change the behavior, then you'll start to see more representation and examples of the narrative that you know to be true. And then you'll actually eventually start to believe it habitually, just like that narrative from your past that you believe just because it was told to you. When you start to do this, it is important that you journal your emotional shifts and your behavioral shifts. Because when you get to a part where the narrative that you were told, like let's say you've done this with 4 different narratives, but you get to that 5th one and it becomes really hard, you become stuck in that one, because you're going to do this for every single narrative that you have and every single limiting belief that you have. We have to start with one, small shift through that one. It's like peeling back the onion. Then you go to the next one and small shift with that one. When those things start to stick, when you write down the change in the motion and change in behavior, when you get really stuck on one, now you have a record of all the times you were able to get through the other ones, and it helps you to become unstuck with this particular one. Old stories are limiting us and keeping us trapped. We don't have to live there. We don't have to be in fear, doubt, and shame. We don't have to have those survival patterns, because we can recognize the story that you've been told, the lies that you've been told. You can re-author that story, you and God together, and you can step into the freedom of the changed behavior that comes as a result of rewiring your brain to believe the truth. If you're in that space today, please share this video. Please try the steps. Comment in the under the video all the things that you found as a result of trying these steps and the takeaway practices, so that other people can see that it's not easy, but it's small shifts that change things over time, and they can see the successes of other people who are doing it too. Please like and subscribe to my channels, follow me on all the socials, and share this video with somebody that you feel it will help to break free from the bondage that they're in and surrender these old narratives over to God so that He can help them live a life of freedom. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again next time.